A plane vanishes in 1955 and then lands 37 years later. The world's biggest particle collider might have cracked open reality itself, and people swear things have felt off ever since. And is it possible that we're all immortal? I'll explain later. These are disturbing signs that you're already living in a parallel universe. Is it possible that we're all immortal? Not in the way that you'll never age or anything like that, but in a more like you'll never die kind of way. It's called quantum immortality, and it's one of the weirder consequences of quantum physics. Here's the basic idea. Most of us have probably heard of the theory that multiple realities form from every decision we make, every situation we find ourselves in. In quantum mechanics, there's a theory that every time something happens, the universe splits, creating a parallel universe where things went the other way. For example, let's say you're walking across the street and you nearly get hit by a bus. Close call. Well, in another reality, the bus didn't miss. In another, you were nowhere near it. In another, the bus didn't even show up. Now, you, the observer, are at the center of your own timeline. Here's where the immortality aspect comes in. If you can't observe a version of the universe where you're dead, you'll always end up in the one where you survive. That means every time you should have died, you just didn't. At least you don't experience the version where you did. From your point of view, you'll always wake up in the version of reality where you lived. Sure, other people might attend your funeral in their timelines, or the ones you used to be in, but you never actually experience death. You just keep shifting into the universe where you dodged the bullet. Now, I'm not exactly sure where old age comes into this. I mean, eventually we all do die, right? But I don't know, maybe reincarnation plays into this somehow. Look, it's totally unprovable, but it's a neat idea, and at the very least, maybe there's a version of all of our lives where we make it to 100 and pass away peacefully in bed, rather than dying in some awful accident or something. Pan Am Flight 914 is a story that keeps getting passed around because, real or not, it's an interesting story. A Pan Am Douglas DC-4 with 62 people on board took off from New York headed to Miami on July 2nd of 1955. It vanished. Radio contact was lost, and it was presumed to have crashed, but then something weird happens. Just not for another 37 years. In 1992, the same plane allegedly appeared out of nowhere on the radar of an airport in Venezuela. Air traffic control made contact and the pilot sounded confused, saying they were en route to Miami and due to land at 9:55 a.m., as if no time had passed. The story goes there were witnesses who said the tower told the pilot where he was, which reportedly freaked him out. He supposedly panicked, restarted the engines, and took off again before anyone could stop him. The plane eventually landed in Miami shortly afterward, but authorities supposedly kept the incident quiet. Some versions of the story say the passengers were dazed, carrying outdated newspapers and IDs with no idea that they just jumped forward in time. But is this just an urban legend, or did something actually unexplainable happen that was quickly covered up? The Large Hadron Collider has been at the center of multiple wild theories ever since it switched on in 2008. Officially, it's a massive particle accelerator built by the European Organization for Nuclear Research, or CERN. It was created to smash atoms together at insane speeds in order to study the makeup of the universe. But there are plenty of people who think that something very strange happened when this thing was switched on, that a sort of Pandora's box was unleashed. One theory is that when the LHC fired up, there was this shift, that it either created a parallel universe or blended ours with another. The timing does kinda line up with when people started reporting strange phenomena on a big scale. The Mandela effect, for example, really exploded in popularity around the same time, but people also started sharing more personal stories on internet forums about how time just didn't seem to be moving right anymore, or how reality felt off in subtle ways they couldn't quite explain. And it didn't help that in 2016, CERN released a video of what looked like a human sacrifice ritual taking place on their grounds, which they later said was a prank. And do I believe that? Yeah, first of all, I just think that's a funny idea. I love that they went there. And I also just don't think there was a genuine ritual sacrifice captured on camera here. For anyone who is already skeptical though, they were even more skeptical after this. But what do you think? Have you noticed weird shifts in your reality since 2008? I'll give you this, it is a weirder world we're living in. In Norse mythology, the cosmos was divided into 9 realms. These realms were connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree, and each realm had its own unique characteristics, creatures, and gods. There was Asgard, the realm of the gods, Midgard, the human world, which is pretty mid, as the Gen Zers would say, and Vanheim, the world of the Vanir gods, who were these gods of nature, fertility, and the prosperity. And then you had Niflheim, the icy underworld, because every civilization needed their own crummy place down below. There are countless stories of Odin and other gods crossing into different realms, either to interact with other beings or to battle the forces of chaos. The idea that there were multiple worlds in existence was fundamental to the Norse. They believed that these realms were real and that crossing between them was possible, especially for the gods and heroes, and of course if you die. The Norse even had their own doomsday prophecy, Ragnarok, where all the realms would clash and be reborn. Ancient Chinese philosophy was built around the idea of multiple realms and planes of existence. In Taoism, for example, they believed in a balance between the physical world, the spiritual world, and other realms. These were places where deities, immortals, and spirits lived and interacted with humans. One key idea was Qi, or life force, which flows between all the realms. Definitely a big inspiration for the Force in Star Wars. Buddhism in China had its own version of parallel worlds with different levels of existence, like Pure Land, where enlightened beings live. The belief was, and still is, that different realms exist in layers. They could influence the living if you know how to connect with them. For the Aboriginal Australians, one of the most ancient civilizations on Earth, Dreamtime is the foundation for how the world was formed and how it still works. It's a whole framework that explains how the land, the animals, and social rules came to be. The ancestors who created everything weren't gods in the usual sense. They were powerful beings who moved through the land, shaping it as they went. Their paths, called song lines, are still followed today through stories, chants, and ceremonies. And these song lines don't just describe a journey, they're believed to hold the journey. By performing the stories in the right place at the right time, people could reconnect with that original power, as if past and present were overlapping. So this Dreamtime isn't described necessarily as back then, it's kinda always there, you just can't always see it. Some groups also describe shifts in awareness or reality during these rituals where the boundaries blur and the world seems to fold. It's not framed in terms of physics, but it does hint at the same ideas, multiple states of existence stacked or side by side, and ways to move between them. The Inca saw reality as divided into 3 main layers: Hanapacha, the upper world; Kayapacha, K-Pacha, the human world; and Ukupacha, the inner or underworld. Hope I'm pronouncing those correctly. Certain caves, springs, and mountaintops were believed to be access points. A cave could be a doorway into Ukupacha, for example, or a mountaintop might connect to Hananpacha. Each location had a specific role and was tied to one of these realms. They used the Chicana or Andean cross to represent how these worlds connected. It was sort of like a map in a way. Its shape and appears in architecture, textiles, and city layouts. It helped to guide how temples were built, how the solstices were marked, and where important rituals would take place. And you had a living person who was believed to move between these realms, the Inca ruler. Even agricultural rituals were tied to these beliefs. Seeds buried in the ground were thought to pass through Ukupacha before rising again. So you could say these beliefs were deeply ingrained. For the Celts, the other world was a realm where gods, spirits, and the dead existed. It was seen as a place that existed alongside our own. The Celts believed the other world had its own rules, landscapes, its own beings. Certain locations on Earth, like caves and lakes and burial mounds, were believed to be portals where the living could pass into this realm. And special times like Samhain, the early version of Halloween, these were seen as moments where the barrier between the worlds was at its thinnest, allowing easier passage for spirits to enter and exit. The Druids, as spiritual leaders, were thought to be able to journey into the other world through rituals and altered states of consciousness. In some stories, people, including warriors, were said to enter the other world, live out their entire lives there, and return as if no time had past. Well, this place looks absolutely nuts. It's like a landscape Dr. Seuss would draw. What you're looking at is the Zang Yi Dangia landform, and yes, these striped hills are entirely natural, formed over 24 million years as layers of sandstone and minerals were pressed together, then pushed upward by tectonic movement. Wind and rain sculpted the sharp ridges and valleys, but the colors, the reds, oranges, yellows, and blues, all arranged in these beautiful stripes, it's amazing. At sunrise and sunset, the entire landscape seems to glow, just exaggerating the already surreal look. There's no blending or soft transitions here. It's all these bold layers of color. The shapes and shades register as familiar, yet completely wrong for a mountain range. It almost just looks too deliberate to be random. Also, I don't know about you, but it kind of looks tasty. I don't know, looks like an ice cream flavor or something. The Salvador Dali desert doesn't look like it belongs to Earth. Looks like it belongs in a dream. Found in southwestern Bolivia, this barren stretch sits at high altitude, scattered with wind-sculpted rocks that look unlike anything else on the planet. Salvador Dali never actually saw this place, but the comparison makes sense. The formations really do look like the distorted shapes from his paintings. A tree made of stone boulders that lean in impossible balances. The most well-known is the stone tree, a narrow trunk supported by a wide crown, like it was carved to be some sort of modern art piece, only of course it wasn't. The desert is silent, dry, mostly lifeless. There are no animals, no buildings, no sounds except the wind, and that just adds to the surreal atmosphere. This place looks unreal. It's called Pumukali. It looks like it's covered in snow, but it's not. What you're looking at is actually solid white stone. See, over thousands of years, hot springs rich in calcium have flowed down the hillside, leaving behind thick mineral deposits that formed into these terraces. The result is a kind of frozen waterfall with bright white steps in these small pools of pale blue water. It looks cold, but it's actually warm to the touch. That contrast is what makes it so strange to walk through. You're standing in what looks like an icy landscape, but there's no ice, and everything is shaped so neatly it almost feels like it must have been created intentionally. The pools are perfectly spaced, the steps look almost evenly cut, but it's all just water and time. It's no surprise that people have been coming here for thousands of years. The ancient city of Hierapolis was built right next to it, and people believed the waters had healing powers. And I can't blame them. Even with crowds around, the layout makes it feel calm and kind of untouched. It doesn't look like any other landscape in the region, or really on the entire planet. Just off the coast of Zakynthos, Greece, there's something strange sitting on the sea floor. It looks like the remains of a sunken city. There are stone pavements, round columns, big flat slabs arranged in what look like neat rows. Divers first thought they discovered some forgotten ancient port or town, but it turns out it's not actually the case. These shapes were formed by natural gas seeps in the ocean floor. Over time, the minerals hardened into these perfectly round and flat structures that just happened to look like parts of a building. Even with that explanation though, it's hard not to question what you're seeing. The geometry feels too deliberate. The slabs connect at right angles. Some of the circular shapes look exactly like carved bases for columns. There are no walls or statues or tools, but your brain still wants it to be ruins. The water here is so clear and shallow too that you can see the whole formation from up above, which only adds to the effect. Salar de Uyuni is the largest salt flat in the world. People say when you're standing in the middle of it, it barely feels real. Looks to me like one of those Windows desktop backgrounds you'd have in the mid-2000s, and I don't mean that in a bad way, just this place just looks breathtaking. Like I just hear ambient Brian Eno music when I look at images here. For most of the year, it's this massive stretch of solid, dry salt, totally flat, pure white, almost nothing breaking up the horizon. It looks like the surface of another planet. But when it rains, the whole thing changes. You get this thin layer of water that settles on top, turning the salt flat into this near perfect mirror. Suddenly the sky is reflected on the ground, and there's no clear line between up and down. You can walk across it and see your own reflection moving below you. Along with the clouds, sun, and whatever else is overhead, it honestly looks like heaven on earth. And that mirror effect is so precise that satellite agencies sometimes use it to calibrate their instruments. But for anyone visiting with no visible landmarks, it's hard to judge distance. Some will say it almost feels like you're floating between two skies, and the flatness makes it almost impossible to tell how far you've walked. There's nothing quite like this place. A woman named Pam Reynolds was brain dead for over an hour. Somehow, she came back describing things she couldn't have possibly known. In 1991, Reynolds underwent a rare procedure called a standstill operation to remove a brain aneurysm. Her body temperature was lowered significantly, her heartbeat and brain activity were completely stopped, and her eyes were taped shut. She was clinically dead, and yet, after she was revived, she gave eerily accurate descriptions of the operating room. She even described the exact surgical tools being used and recounted conversations between doctors. That's because when she was under, she claimed that she floated out of her body and saw herself laying on the table before being pulled toward a tunnel of light. She said she met dead relatives there who communicated with her without speaking, and that she needed to be convinced to return to her body, which of course she did. But what exactly happened here? How could someone with no brain function, no sensory input, describe real-time events in such clear detail? Till this day, there's never been a definitive explanation for this. Ong's Hat was a real village in New Jersey, now abandoned. In the late 80s though, pamphlets and documents started surfacing claiming secret experiments happened there involving interdimensional travel. So a group called the Institute for Chaos Studies allegedly set up a lab in the Pine Barrens. There they built a device known as the Egg, a sensory deprivation pod meant to alter consciousness. The theory was that under the right conditions, the pod could shift someone into a parallel universe. Well, supposedly it worked. Some of the researchers vanished, remaining in some alternate version of Earth. These so-called documents circulated in zines and early internet forums. Nowadays, this is mostly seen as a hoax, and I'm sure a lot of people also saw it that way back then, but some still insist there was something strange actually going on here, that maybe, at the very least, the story was some sort of cover-up for actual experiments with, fictional elements used to discredit anything and distract people from anything disturbing that was actually happening. I don't know, what do you guys think of this one? Bold Street has become a rather infamous area in Liverpool, where dozens of people have claimed to experience time slips. One story goes that a young woman named Imogen had gone shopping for some things for her sister's new baby. As she walked toward the corner of Lord Street in Whitechapel, she was excited to see a new mother care store that she hadn't noticed before. Inside, she browsed through items like baby cardigans and bibs, surprised at how cheap everything was. When she went to pay with her credit card at the front, the cashier looked confused and called the manager over. The manager turned and told Imogen that they didn't accept credit cards, only cash. Since she had none on her, Imogen left empty-handed, but when she told her mother what happened, her mom looked stunned. The mother care store had closed years ago, and the spot was now a bank, the very bank her mom used. And that's not the only weird story to come out of Bold Street. In 2006, a young man named Sean was caught shoplifting in Liverpool. While fleeing down Hanover Street, he turned into Brooks Alley, a dead end. As he caught his breath, he suddenly felt strange, like the air had thickened. He basically just waited for the security guard to follow, but no one came. Confused, Sean stepped back out into Hanover Street and instantly knew something was wrong. The street looked older. The cars were vintage. Roadworks he'd seen earlier were gone. People walked by in these outdated clothes, and there were traffic lights where there shouldn't be any. Sean pulled out his phone. There was no signal. He rushed towards Bold Street and spotted a newspaper stand. The date on the paper was May 18th, 1967. Terrified, Sean ran to a jewelry store where he pulled out his phone again, and this time it worked. Just like that, he was back in the present. Later, when he told his story to the local press, he repeated it in the exact same way every time, and while people assumed he made it up to dodge shoplifting charges, the newspaper followed up, and not only did they find his account consistent, but all the historical details he described, down to the clothes, the street layout, businesses, they were accurate for Liverpool in 1967. Even the security guard kinda backed it up. He said when he chased Sean into Brooks Alley, the kid had simply vanished. On November 9th of 1986, Spanish industrial expert Pedro Ramirez was driving from Seville to Alcalá del Guadera late at night. He knew the road well, but suddenly after a curve everything changed. The road widened into 3 massive lanes in each direction, surrounded by tall, strange buildings that he didn't recognize. On one side were huge glowing industrial buildings, on the other were these towering apartment buildings with 20 floors or so. None of it made sense, and things just got weirder from there. Pedro started to feel a wave of heat inside his car, along with strange voices, almost like a distant choir. One voice told him he'd been transported to another country or possibly another planet by extraterrestrials. And for the next couple hours he drove through this strange place, even stopping a couple times to walk along the roadside and study the odd grass and the bizarre traffic. Noticed that cars passed him every 8 minutes or so, like clockwork. Eventually, Pedro reached a road sign with directions to his home, or where he was coming from. Well, he chose to retrace his steps, but he suddenly found himself parked in front of his house, and he had no memory of how he got there. He tried to retrace his path, but the wide roads, the buildings, and the strange signs were gone now. And somehow the trip, which should have only taken him about 30 minutes, had lasted over 3 hours, and he'd burned way more fuel than normal. Over the last few decades, thousands of people have vanished in national parks and forests across North America. Some of these cases are a lot stranger than others and share some eerie patterns. The person disappears suddenly, often in the middle of a group, only to be found, if they're found at all, in places that had already been searched, sometimes miles away, sometimes in impossible locations like high cliffs or extra dense parts of the woods that would be super hard to reach even with gear. And in some of these cases, the missing person reappears with zero memory of where they've been or how long they were gone. Former police officer David Paulides has been collecting these cases under what he calls Missing 411. He specifically filters out incidents with logical explanations, so that what's left are stories that truly don't make sense. In some reports, tracking dogs have refused to follow the scent or get visibly spooked. Clocks act strangely, storms roll in out of nowhere, and in a few extreme examples, the person claims they were watched or lured by something they couldn't quite explain. One theory is that these people aren't just getting lost, they're slipping through cracks in reality. In the early 80s, rumors started circulating about strange military experiments happening at Camp Hero, an old Air Force station in Montauk, New York. The story went that there was psychic testing going on, time travel, and the opening of gateways to other dimensions. A few people had come forward saying they'd been a part of it, either willingly or as kids who were abducted into the program. According to these accounts, the government was trying to weaponize the human mind. They supposedly succeeded in creating psychic soldiers who could manipulate objects, see and hear things that were going on from very distant locations, or even open dimensional rifts. There's one story where they allegedly opened a portal too wide and something came through, something not human. Supposedly, they shut the project down after that. Another account describes a time chair, which let people travel into the past or future, but often came with disorienting side effects. Of course, there have never been any official documents that have confirmed any of this. It's easy to pass this off as an urban legend, but the thing is, some of the same people involved in these stories also had ties to MKUltra, which was very real and proven. So that's kind of given the Montauk project a little more validity to some. As always though, what do you think? This next one goes back to 1943, in the middle of World War II. The story is that US Navy tried to make a ship invisible to radar at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The ship was the USS Eldridge, but according to people who claim to have witnessed it, something much stranger happened. That's putting it lightly. Something cosmically horrific happened. They say the ship vanished completely and then reappeared hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, and when it came back, the crew was not well. First off, there were a ton of them missing, and many who had shown back up with the ship were quite literally with the ship. They'd fused into the metal. The lucky ones just went insane, claiming to have seen something on the other side. The Navy has always denied that anything like this happened, but the story came to light through a man named Carl Allen, who sent letters detailing the events later. Of course, he was written off for being unstable, but the story took off anyway. There's even an X-Files episode about this one. To be fair, X-Files goes in some incredibly weird directions, so this is in no way adding validity to the story, but it does go to show just how much the Philadelphia experiment, as it came to be called, was talked about. What's interesting about this story is how specific it is, too. It doesn't really feel like your typical urban legend. It sounds more like someone trying to explain something that they don't fully understand. Who knows, maybe something strange really did happen that day. Maybe there really was an experiment that caused a breach in the fabric of reality. Sicatra is one of the strangest places on Earth. Not because of any one thing, it's because almost everything about this place feels off. If you ever wanted to visit Pandora from Avatar, this is probably as close as you're gonna get, on Earth at least. The island is part of Yemen, but it broke off from mainland Africa millions of years ago, and in that time, it's developed a completely unique ecosystem. And people say unique a lot to describe things. That really does fit here. About a third of the plant life can't be found anywhere else on the planet. The most famous example is the dragon's tree, which looks like a giant umbrella and bleeds red sap when it's cut. Now that's just the start. There are bottle-shaped trees, bizarre shrubs, weird-looking reptiles and birds that evolved in total isolation. Even the coastline looks kind of strange, with pale beaches leading into rocky cliffs and caves carved into limestone. You walk around and get the sense that someone shuffled together a desert, a jungle, and like a sci-fi set. At least that's how it's described, and that's what I can see looking at it. I've never been. I would absolutely love to go, though. Feels like it belongs to a different version of Earth entirely. And local legends talk about how ancient sailors would arrive here and then think they'd found the edge of the known world, and it's easy to see why. Lake Hillier is bright pink. It's not kind of pink. The place is unapologetically Barbie pink. It sits on an island off the coast of Western Australia, surrounded by dark green forest and blue ocean on the other side, and the contrast is just ridiculous. There's no like slow transition here. It's just this sharp line between pink and then you got everything else. And the water stays pink even when you scoop it into a bottle. Scientists think that it's caused by a microbe that releases a pigment under certain conditions, but no one's completely figured this out. The lake's only about 600 meters across, no rivers feeding into it, and nothing around it that looks even remotely similar. It's completely harmless too, you can swim in it. You can't swim in this next place though. The Danakil Depression in Ethiopia is one of the most extreme environments on Earth. It's brutally hot, with temperatures regularly hitting over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or roughly 50 degrees Celsius. The landscape here looks almost like a planet that's still forming. You'll see sulfur springs that glow this neon yellow and green. Bubbling and steaming acidic pools are everywhere, and salt flats are cracked into these sharp, jagged patterns. As you can probably imagine, the air smells like sulfur and salt, and there's almost no plant or animal life except for tiny organisms. Some scientists actually come here to study how early Earth might have looked. Others use it as a stand-in for what alien life might deal with, on other planets. Because nothing about this place looks stable. The ground is always hissing and smoking, and it feels like it could change shape overnight. I kind of imagine it smells like farts, but you'd have to tell me if you've ever been. Flag Geyser in Nevada wasn't supposed to exist. In the 1960s, a geothermal company drilled into the ground looking for energy, and then they accidentally tapped into a pressurized spring. They capped it, but the seal didn't hold. Hot, mineral-rich water started pouring out, and it just never stopped. Over time, those minerals built up into this mound, and algae took over, turning the geyser into this multicolored thing that you're looking at now. Multiple sprouts constantly spraying out hot water. I mean, this thing is indescribable. First of all, look at the colors, the reds, greens, and yellows. It's shaped like something you'd see in a coral reef. It's not huge, maybe about 12 feet tall, but it sticks out like crazy in the middle of this dry, flat desert. Looks like it was grown in a lab. And something went wrong. Unfortunately, it's on private land, and it's not generally open to the public, so most people only see it in photos, but it's very real, and it's still changing. So if hippie tie-dye somehow became a place, it would have to be the Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone. This is the largest hot spring in the United States, and easily one of the most colorful. From above, it looks like this giant, trippy eye, deep blue in the center, then rings of green, yellow, orange, and red moving outward. Each band is filled with different types of microbes, each one thriving in a specific temperature. The center is near boiling, crystal clear, but as the water cools near the edges, different microbes take over and change the color. The air is full of steam here, and that constant haze makes the whole thing almost look like it's glowing or breathing. You can't get too close, there's a boardwalk that keeps you at a safe distance, but even from there, it just doesn't look like it should be real. They're staring at a pool that's basically a living chemical reaction, all laid out in these perfect rings. Looks pretty incredible. Alright, this one's a bit of a strange rabbit hole. It revolves around a movie that doesn't actually exist, but has a bizarre legend attached to it. So there's this film that supposedly starred the actor Sinbad. If you're like me, you know him from the Arnold Schwarzenegger classic Jingle All the Way. But some also remember Sinbad having been in this movie called Shazam in the 90s, where he played a genie. The premise is that he granted wishes and caused chaos in typical 90s kids movie fashion. A lot of people swear they saw this movie, renting it or watching reruns of it on TV. The only problem is no one can find it now. For years, people have tried to track down any trace of this Shazam movie, but it doesn't seem to exist anywhere in any record. Sinbad himself has even come out and said, like, yeah, I never made that movie. And yet, a surprising number of people are adamant that they remember it. It's become one of the more popular Mandela effects, where a large number of people remember something one way, which turns out to be different, or in this case, not even existing at all. So, what's going on here? Well, one theory is that people are confusing it with another movie called Shazam, starring Shaquille O'Neal as the genie, which was released in 1996. And yeah, I can see people getting confused about the name, but I mean, are all of these people really confusing Sinbad with Shaq? That doesn't really add up. I mean, it's possible, but what if there's a parallel universe where things are just slightly different, and in that universe, there really is a movie called Shazam starring Sinbad, and this very second, there's another version of me filming a video being like, damn, I could have sworn there was a movie called Shazam back in the 90s starring Shaq, but nobody can find it. Next up is Bermeja, a whole island that completely vanished. This one's wild because it really was a real place, a tiny island in the Gulf of Mexico near the Yucatan Peninsula. You could find it on old maps, and even the Mexican government used to claim that it existed. In fact, it was officially documented as part of Mexico's territory, right in the area where they had a territorial dispute with the US over oil rights. Well, in 1997, a Mexican Navy survey came out saying the island was no longer there. They couldn't find it with any of their modern equipment, even though it was supposed to be there, of course. Having been marked on maps for hundreds of years, the island seemed to have just disappeared though. Well, your first thought is that it probably just sank into the ocean, but that's highly unlikely because the area was relatively shallow and there's actually no sign of the island ever having existed in the first place. So what are some other possibilities? Well, some people think it was deliberately erased from maps as part of some secret government deal. Others say cartographers had been wrong the entire time, and that the island was either never there or is a misidentified rock or sandbar that got labeled as an island. But there's a more fringe idea too, one that ties into the title of this video, of course. The idea that Bermeja never existed in the first place, and what we're actually dealing with is a glitch or shift between parallel universes. Some say it's like the island slipped through the cracks of time and was never meant to be in our reality at all. Now let's talk about Flight 19, one of the most famous disappearances in aviation history, and of course, it's tied to the Bermuda Triangle. This incident goes back to December 5th of 1945. Flight 19 was a training mission for 5 US Navy bombers flying out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Everything was going well until something went horribly wrong. The pilots lost their bearings, and they got disoriented. According to reports, they were never able to get a proper fix on their location, and things quickly went from bad to worse. One of the pilots even reported that the compass wasn't working right, but the entire squadron of 5 planes just vanished, like they were swallowed up by the ocean. No wreckage was ever found, and the Navy couldn't figure out exactly what happened. And on top of that, a rescue plane was sent out to search for them. That plane also went missing. No trace of it was ever found either. The story just adds more mystery when you consider how much equipment was searching and still nothing showed up. People started speculating, of course. Some think it was probably a simple navigation error or mechanical failure, nothing too crazy, but others believe that the Bermuda Triangle was involved, that maybe this mysterious region of the ocean is some sort of portal or electromagnetic anomaly that messes with navigation systems, sucking planes and ships into some other dimension or an alternate reality. Others go even further, saying that UFOs or time warps are to blame, but at the end of the day, no one knows what really happened to Flight 19, which is exactly why it's still talked about to this day. In the small town of Taos, New Mexico, people have been hearing a strange sound since the early 90s, a low-frequency hum, like a distant engine running, a hum that never seems to go away. Not everyone hears it, but for those who do, it's constant. Where does it come from? Well, that's the mystery. But the people who hear it report headaches, insomnia, and just overall dread, like something's just off. The government has sent scientists to investigate. They've recorded the environment, tested the soil, the air, everything, but they couldn't find what was actually causing it. The hum isn't picked up by microphones or equipment, so it's basically impossible to study. It's almost like it's happening inside the victims' bodies, which is about as terrifying as it sounds, no pun intended. Now, there are theories as to what this could be. Electromagnetic interference, underground drilling, some sort of secret military technology, but is it possible people are hearing something even stranger than that? Like an echo from another dimension? Maybe the hum isn't a sound at all, but more of a frequency from another place, something leaking in. Just a thought. This story popped up on Reddit a couple years back from a user who deleted their account shortly after posting. Here's what they wrote. I've lived in the same apartment for about 4 years. It's nothing fancy, 1 bedroom, open kitchen, small balcony, but about 2 weeks ago I came home from work and noticed something weird. The door handle felt different, like it was just slightly lower than I remembered. Same style, same lock, just off. When I walked in, everything looked normal at first, but my keys were in a different bowl than I usually leave them. I thought maybe I was just tired, but then I noticed my bookshelf. There were 2 books on it that I don't own. One of them was a collection of short stories by Ray Bradbury that I'd been meaning to buy but hadn't yet. The other was a guidebook for a city I've never been to. I asked my girlfriend if she bought them over. She said no. I called my landlord just to be sure no one had entered while I was at work. He checked. Nothing. Since then, a few other tiny things have changed. A painting in the hallway is an inch higher. My phone background changed to a photo I don't remember taking. I know how this sounds, but it feels like I came back to a version of my life that's almost the same, just not quite. Guys, I can't speak to the validity of stories like this on Reddit. If you are experiencing things like this, go to a doctor. Just, some advice. In December of 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers stationed on the remote Flannan Isles off the coast of Scotland vanished without a trace. When a relief crew arrived after a storm had delayed them, they found the lighthouse empty. Everything inside was undisturbed. Clocks had stopped, meals were left on the table, and one of the men's coats was still hanging on a hook. The only clue was a logbook entry mentioning a violent storm, but the weather had actually been pretty calm the day they supposedly wrote it. No bodies were ever found. The official explanation is that a massive wave may have swept them out to sea, but that doesn't add up. Why were there no signs of struggle, no debris, nothing washed up? It was like they just stepped off the island and vanished. For decades, amateur astronomers and conspiracy theorists have pointed to something strange orbiting Earth, an unidentified object known as the Black Knight satellite. The story really kicked off in the 50s when both the US and Soviet Union detected something unusual in orbit. It wasn't one of theirs. It didn't match the movement of any known satellites at the time. And then there's the really weird part. In the 70s, images taken during a NASA mission seemed to show this strange, jagged object in orbit, and it didn't look like space junk or any known satellite. Some believe it's been up there for 13,000 years, sent by an ancient civilization or aliens as a monitoring device. Nikola Tesla himself claimed to have received a repeating signal from space in the 1890s, and some now connect that to this. No one knows exactly what it is. NASA says the object in the photos is just a thermal blanket that came loose during a mission, but that explanation doesn't sit well with people who've followed the story for decades. If it really is something watching us from above, then who or what put it there, and how long have they been watching? We haven't done a comment shout out for a while, so considering you guys left us some pretty interesting comments on part 1 of this video, I figured I'd read one out. From Dangleberry Snoot comes this comment. A person I knew died in 2018 and I attended her funeral. 3 years later, I was in a terrible car crash and came out without injury. Emergency service workers couldn't believe I walked away. Later that year, I received a message on Facebook that my friend in 2018, who died, had somehow just died, and I attended her funeral for a second time. Something very odd is occurring in this world. This has become a rather infamous story on Reddit. Always reminds me of the Star Trek The Next Generation episode Inner Light. So this guy takes a hit to the head and blacks out. But instead of being out for a few seconds, the guy ends up living what feels like 10 full years in a completely different life. Entirely in his head, of course. In this other version of reality, he meets a woman, falls in love, settles down, starts a family. They go grocery shopping, they argue about bills, they play with their kids in the yard. He remembers what the weather was like. He remembers birthdays. I mean, we're talking real grounded stuff here. This doesn't sound like the type of wacky nonsense that goes on in dreams. Felt like real life. 10 years of it, mind you. But one day in that world, he starts noticing something strange. There's this lamp in the living room, totally normal looking, but it doesn't fit. It starts bugging him. It's like a little glitch. And the more he stares at it, the more everything else starts to feel wrong. And that's when it all starts unraveling. Suddenly he wakes up. He's lying on the ground, surrounded by people. He's back where he was right before he blacked out. Only minutes have passed. But the man is absolutely devastated. The life he just came back to doesn't feel right anymore. He remembers his wife and kids from the other world. He misses them. They weren't real though, but the emotions were. For a long time after, he struggled. He said it felt like he was mourning people who never existed. Now, was this a case of the brain doing weird things under stress? Or did he tap into something else, a different version of his life that's playing out somewhere, a parallel universe? Ken Korczak, a writer and journalist, had one of the most bizarre experiences, writing an article claiming that he'd slipped into a parallel universe. It wasn't like a whole new world, just a slightly different version of his own home and garden. He said the differences were subtle at first. His pets, specifically his cats and chickens, were behaving completely differently than he was used to. It's like they were the same animals, but something was just off about them, like seeing them through a different lens. In his words, it felt like everything in his yard was a few degrees askew. But the weirdest part came when he met this strange female entity. She wasn't human, at least not in the way you'd think. Korczak described her as resembling an elf or a fairy, and she seemed completely at home in this alternate reality. He also described feeling like she was there for a reason, like she was some kind of guide in this parallel world. He spent a lot of time reflecting on it, especially the strange, almost magical feeling of meeting this being. He genuinely believes that he had a real encounter with a parallel version of his home. As someone who's always been interested in the concept of alternate realities too, he dove deep, trying to make sense of it. Was this just a hallucination, or did he actually slip into another dimension for a brief moment? In December of 2024, Google made a pretty big announcement about their new quantum chip, Willow. This chip solved a problem in 5 minutes that would have taken even the fastest supercomputers 47 years. What was amazing here though wasn't just how fast the chip was, it's also what the head of Google's quantum AI team, Hartmut Nevins, said about it. He mentioned that this speed might be a sign that their quantum computers are pulling from multiple realities at once. Not just a throwaway comment, he was serious about this. Now, this ties in with something called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which states that every decision or event causes the universe to split into different versions, creating a parallel reality for each possibility. So when a quantum computer like Willow does a calculation, it's possible that it's tapping into these other universes, running all the possibilities at once, without us even realizing it. And it's not just Google talking along these lines. Other tech companies like IBM and D-Wave have been exploring quantum computing for years, and some think this technology could eventually lead us to understand or even interact with alternate realities. It's not quite science fiction anymore. Quantum computing might be the closest thing we've got to real-world proof that the multiverse could exist. The USS Cyclops was this massive American naval vessel that disappeared without a trace in 1918. It was carrying over 300 crew members and a hefty load of manganese ore from the Caribbean to Baltimore, and it vanished somewhere again in the Bermuda Triangle. It's one of the most baffling disappearances in naval history, and what makes it so mysterious is that this wasn't just a random ship lost at sea. It was a huge ship with a solid reputation. It was part of the US Navy during World War II. The Cyclops had been a workhorse for the Navy for years, but when it set out from Barbados in March of 1918, something obviously went wrong. It didn't check in when it was supposed to, and no one heard from it again. The ship was huge, 541 feet long, and it was designed to withstand the rough seas, so it's hard to believe it could just sink without a trace. No wreckage was ever found. Some think a freak storm or a mechanical failure could have caused it to sink. Others believe the ship was sabotaged, maybe by enemies during the war, but because the thing disappeared somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle, some people of course think something stranger may have happened. In 1587, a group of English settlers landed on Roanoke Island, which is off the coast of modern-day North Carolina. They were sent to establish a permanent colony, but when a supply ship returned in 1590, they were gone, completely vanished. The settlement was empty, not a single person was left behind. There wasn't even any sign of a struggle. It was as if the whole colony had never even been there in the first place. But they had been. There was a clue that remained. The only sign of them was Croatoan, carved into a tree, the word. Now, the thing is, Croatoan was the name of a nearby island and also the name of a Native American tribe in the area. So, some believe the settlers may have tried to integrate with the tribe, but why would they leave behind such a cryptic message? Could they have been forced to leave by some hostile force, or did they just abandon the colony altogether? Maybe they just moved further inland, but then why did they leave no trace of where they went? Of course, there's also the theory that something much stranger happened. Some people wonder the settlers didn't vanish into the woods or the sea at all, but rather slipped into some other dimension, like a glitch in the fabric of time or space. Could Roanoke have been one of those spots in history where a tear in reality caused an entire settlement to disappear? Now, I will admit that this one may be a bit of a stretch, but I do think it's kind of fascinating, so I feel like it's worth adding here. You might not even know this, but at one point in US history there were $1,000 bills. The US Treasury printed $1,000 notes. These bills were mainly used for huge bank transfers and business deals, not something people would really carry around in their wallet. They were officially discontinued in 1969, along with other high-value bills like $500 and even $5,000 notes. But a lot of these old bills have just disappeared. The US Treasury estimates that millions of dollars worth of these $1,000 bills are still out there somewhere, but where? I mean, are they all hidden away in private collections? Maybe, but there are some conspiracy theories here too. Some believe that certain bills were deliberately destroyed or hidden by the government to keep the true extent of the nation's wealth under wraps. Others think that the bills might still be circulating under the radar in the hands of shadowy people and underground deals. Next is a very strange phenomenon called the Taos hum, a low-frequency sound that can only be heard by a small percentage of people. But for those who do hear it, it's maddening. This hum is mostly heard around Taos, New Mexico, but there have been reports from all over the world of similar sounds in other locations like parts of England, Canada, and Japan. The hum is described as this low rumbling sound, like a distant diesel engine running constantly. But when investigators try to find the source, well, they can't. It's not coming from machinery or anything else that can be easily identified. People who hear it often report feeling headaches and insomnia though. Scientists have thrown out theories like tinnitus, which is an ear condition that can cause ringing in the ears, but this isn't really a ringing sound. Some wonder if the hum could be related to electromagnetic fields in the area or seismic activity in the Earth's crust, but some people believe the Taos hum may be stranger, caused by interdimensional energy shifting through our world because of some tear in the fabric of reality, a hint of a parallel universe bleeding through. In 1966, two Brazilian men, Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana, were found dead on a hilltop wearing lead masks, the kind used to shield from radiation. A cop found their bodies after they'd gone missing. The men were lying side by side, there were no signs of a struggle, and there was a small bottle of water next to them. But the masks, nobody could figure out what those were about. They were also carrying a note that looked like instructions for some sort of ritual, mentioning radiation and how to use the masks. The whole thing made it seem like they were about to do some sort of experiment, but no one could figure out what. Were they part of some secret cult? Were they trying to contact aliens? Or were they mixed up in some government experiment? Nobody knows, and no one ever found out how they died. In 1851, a man calling himself Jopar Voren was picked up by local authorities in the town of Frankfurt Oder, in what was then Prussia. He didn't speak German fluently, but he understood it well enough to communicate, and what he told them left everyone confused. He claimed to be from a country called Luxaria, which he said was in a region called Sacria, supposedly somewhere in the Eastern Hemisphere. Never heard of it? Well, yeah, nobody else did either. It wasn't on any map, it wasn't part of any empire, and it never has been. It didn't exist. But Jopar was dead serious. He said he was searching for his long-lost brother, and when asked to show his documents, he produced papers written in a completely unknown language. He also claimed to be fluent in multiple languages, some of which had no record of ever existing either, like Luxarian and Abramian. Eventually, authorities labeled him a lunatic and sent him off for further investigation, and that's the last the world ever heard of him. There was never any follow-up. If this guy ever really did exist, he probably ended up in an asylum, and if you know anything about mental institutions at the time, you know they were basically hell on earth. Makes sense he was never heard from again. Was this guy mentally unstable though, or is there really a chance that he somehow slipped from an alternate reality, a different version of Earth where Luxaria was as real as Germany? And in this alternate Earth, is there a more handsome version of me doing a video just like this, but talking about how Jopar Voren mysteriously vanished into thin air and was never seen again? In the heart of Liverpool, there's a street called Bold Street. Nothing crazy at first glance, just shops, cafes, people going about their day, but ask around and you'll likely hear whispers about something very strange. People slipping through time. One of the most famous stories comes from 1996. A guy named Frank was walking with his wife near Bold Street. She popped into a bookstore and he strolled ahead to a music shop. As he crossed the street, everything suddenly changed. Modern cars vanished, the noises around him dulled, and when he looked around, he was standing in what looked like 1950s Liverpool. People were dressed in post-war clothes, and there were old-school shop fronts where modern businesses should have been. He even saw a store called Crips, which hadn't existed in decades. A few moments later, the world flickered again, and he was back in the present like nothing had happened. Frank swore that this happened though, and he's not the only one. There are dozens of reports from people who say they've walked Bold Street and wound up in the past. Some just for a few seconds, others for minutes. Is it just a coincidence, hallucinations, or is Bold Street sitting on some kind of weird wrinkle in time, a natural glitch in the matrix, if you will? In 1979, two British couples, Geoff and Pauline Simpson and Len and Cynthia Gisby, were driving through France on their way to a holiday in Spain. While passing through Paris, they decided to stop for the night. They pulled off the main road and found this charming, old-fashioned hotel. Nothing fancy, but it was cozy and heavy wooden furniture. No modern conveniences though, like none. The beds didn't have pillows even, it was just bolsters. The windows had these old wooden shutters, odd but charming in a vintage kind of way. They even had dinner at the attached restaurant, where they were served a very basic, kind of old school meal by staff in these outdated uniforms. The whole night also only cost them about 19 francs total. That's about $21.50 US. Even in the 70s, that was suspiciously cheap. They tried to find the hotel again on their way back through Paris, but it was gone completely. They retraced their route. They asked locals. Nobody had ever heard of this place though. The road they remembered taking didn't seem to exist anymore. They later checked their photos from the trip, but the ones they took of the hotel were gone. They just weren't there. But both couples swore up and down that this was real. So did they spend the night in a building that slipped forward through time, or did they slip backward into some echo of a Paris that no longer was there? In 2009, a guy named James Richards claimed he had a very weird experience in California. According to him, he was out driving near Del Porto Canyon with his dog when it took off chasing a rabbit. He ran after it, tripped, hit his head, and blacked out. When he came to, he was in what looked like a regular room with furniture, but there were also machines he didn't recognize. A man introduced himself as Jonas and said that while on a work-related trip from a dimensional travel agency, he had used the machine to transport the unconscious Richards to this parallel Earth in order to help him. This alternate version of Earth was very similar to ours, but with some key differences. One being that in Jonas's world, the Beatles were all still alive and making music. Naturally, James didn't believe it until Jonas gave him a cassette tape. The label said Everyday Chemistry was a compilation of Beatles songs that didn't exist here. James brought the tape back with him when he returned to our world, and he posted the whole thing on a website he made. The music's on there. It does kind of sound like the Beatles' version of like Pink Floyd's Division Bell, like just music they would have done in their later years. Is this just a really creative art project or a hoax though? Or is there a chance there's really a whole Beatles album online from a parallel universe? Back in the 12th century, the quiet village of Woolpit in England got a visit from two very strange kids. A brother and sister showed up out of nowhere, looking completely lost. They were also bright green, not a sickly green, kind of like Shrek hue. The locals were kind of freaked out, but they took them in. The kids didn't speak any recognizable language. They were terrified of sunlight, and they refused to eat anything except raw beans for days. Now, eventually they adjusted a bit. The boy unfortunately got sick and died not long after, but the girl survived and slowly learned to speak English. And that's when she started telling people some pretty strange things. She said they came from a place called St. Martin's Land, where everything had a greenish twilight and the sun never fully shone. According to her, the two of them had been tending to their father's flock when they heard this loud noise and suddenly found themselves in Woolpit. Were these mysterious green children from some different culture and just got lost, or had they somehow wandered out of a parallel world? So it's a sweltering day in July of 1954 at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. A man arrives on an international flight and walks up to customs. Everything seems routine. He looks European, speaks multiple languages, and has a legit-looking passport, from a distance that is. Looking at it up close, turns out this passport says he's from a country called Taured. Never heard of it? Neither had the Japanese officials. They ask him to point it out on a map, and without hesitation he points to the area around where Andorra is, between France and Spain, but he's confused. He insists Taured has been a country for over 1,000 years. The customs officers are confused, to say the least. Is this a joke? Is the guy just out of his mind? The guy seems just as confused as they are. His passport has stamps from other countries, including past visits to Japan, and he has multiple currencies in his wallet. He even mentions a business trip and says he's got meetings set up with a company in Tokyo, but when the officials call the company, they say they've never heard of him. Same story with the hotel that he claimed to have booked. At this point, they're really not sure what to do with him, so they put him up in a hotel room under guard for the night while they try to figure things out. But by the next morning, he's gone. The room was locked from the outside. There was no way out, at least none that the guards wouldn't have been able to see. To this day, no one knows who he was or where he came from, really. Some think he slipped into our world from another reality and then slipped right back out. Others think this whole story is just a good old-fashioned urban legend, but if we seriously consider the possibility that the multiverse really is a thing, well then this story starts to sound a little less outlandish. The Marcahuasi Stone Forest in Peru is one of those places that seems to have a ton of weird stuff happening. People have been talking about strange occurrences there for years, mostly because the place is filled with these huge stone structures that look like they belong to some ancient civilization. But there are also some strange stories surrounding this place. Well, one goes that a group of hikers got a lot more than they bargained for when they camped here. While hanging out, they started to hear some music coming from what seemed like a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It sounded like a celebration. The group looked around and sure enough, they spotted a stone cabin lit up from the inside and they could see people dancing through the windows. The people were dressed like they were from the 1600s, all in old-fashioned clothes. Naturally, one of the hikers decided to check things out. She got closer to the cabin, and the closer she got, the stranger things became. Her friend noticed that she was acting off, like her body was stiff and she wasn't walking right. It got even weirder when she suddenly couldn't move her arm, like she was partially paralyzed. They managed to pull her away from the cabin, and she snapped out of it right away. People who know the area say the Markawasi might be some kind of doorway between dimensions or timelines. The idea is that certain spots on Earth might have thin barriers to other worlds, and that cabin could have been a glimpse into some different time. This story comes from a Reddit user named Albert Norman 2069, who shared an experience that left him questioning everything about the world. It had all started on June 28, 2014, a day that seemed normal at first. He'd woken up, brushed his teeth, ate breakfast, and headed out to work. But as he turned on the car radio, something wasn't right. Instead of the usual music, the station was airing a talk show. The host was excitedly talking about something called victory in the Great War and praising the troops for their role in this victory. At first, the Redditor thought maybe it was some kind of special segment, but the more the host went on, the stranger things got. There was talk of a victory in Italy and something about the Second Great Depression finally coming to an end. He was confused, but he ended up brushing things off. It was probably just fictional. But then things started getting even stranger when he was at work. During lunch, he overheard his coworkers talking about the same victory in Italy, and they kept mentioning the numbers 33 to 13. When he asked what they were talking about, they acted like he was the odd one for not knowing. And when he asked about a coworker named Sam, who didn't seem to be there, no one seemed to remember it. At least something was very off. On his way home, he decided to take a different route to avoid traffic, and that's when he noticed that the city looked worse than he remembered. Buildings were crumbling, some were abandoned, and there were banners everywhere again celebrating this mysterious victory. When he finally got home, he flicked on the news. The anchors were talking about the victory in Italy and how the US was dealing with a war abroad. Europe was also in chaos, and the US was in an even worse depression than the 1930s. Of course, things went back to normal by the next day. So was it just a really vivid dream? Well, possibly. But perhaps Albert Norman 2069 really did spend a day in a much darker version of our own reality. Next up are some pretty strange cave paintings, the Wanginas, some of the most mysterious and downright eerie cave art on Earth. These ancient paintings are found in the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, painted by Aboriginal tribes whose culture has been going strong for over 60,000 years. The Wanginas, according to legend, were sky beings, spirits from the clouds who came down during dream time, said to be this time when the Earth was still being formed. These beings supposedly created the land, animals, people, everything. They taught the Aboriginals how to live, and then they vanished. Some say they returned to the stars, others say they went underground. But, I mean, just look at these cave paintings, the big black eyes, the pale skin, they look like aliens. But this art is estimated to be tens of thousands of years old, long before anyone was talking about aliens, at least not in the modern sense. Kinda makes you wonder, are the Wanginas more than just myth? Did these ancient tribes actually encounter something from beyond the stars, or maybe even from a parallel reality? This final story comes from Reddit user GoodResolve33 and goes as follows. When I was younger, my cousins and I would play in my aunt's basement during major holiday parties. Parents would be upstairs and we would all just hang out and mess around in the basement, entertaining ourselves with whatever junk was down there. Well, there was a metal door down there with a bolt lock that we never touched. But one day, we unlocked the door and we saw a major boxing event going on. I'm talking Jumbotron, bright lights, arena, and a major crowd. Everything seemed to freeze when we opened the door though. People in the crowd turned around to look at us. Fighters stopped fighting, the referee signaled us out, and we saw shadows in the crowd running toward us. It all sounds crazy, but I remember how scared we were. We shut the door, ran upstairs, and sat in the living room with our parents. I remember them being like, "What's going on with these guys?" As we sat in the living room silent, crapping ourselves because we thought we were going to get in trouble. Fast forward to much later, I tried to tell my parents and they swear that I imagined it. I thought I did too for the longest time, until randomly, one of my cousins from that day hit me up after so long of not communicating, only to bring up that same event, detail for detail as I described and remembered it. I go back to that house to check out the door. Across the door is the neighbor's basement door, since it was a duplex, and stairs leading up the metal basement doors that come out to the backyard. Not sure what the F that was, and I promise you I'm not that crazy. I get goosebumps thinking about the situation sometimes because it makes absolutely zero sense. The ancient Egyptians had one of the most elaborate ideas about the afterlife and the structure of reality itself. I mean, they may have not talked about parallel universes in a scientific way, but they did believe in these different layers of existence. One of the most important was the Duat, often called the underworld, a realm of gods, gates, and monsters. Souls had to pass through it to reach the afterlife, and the journey wasn't symbolic. The Egyptians believed that this realm was just as real as the physical one. They also believed the soul had multiple parts, Ka, Ba, etc., and that each part could interact with different planes of existence. The gods themselves traveled freely between these realms. Rituals, spells like the ones in the Book of the Dead, and architecture like the pyramids and tombs were designed to help souls move between these realities. So they didn't see reality as only what was in front of their eyes. They believed there were layers to it. So in that sense, their entire belief system was built around the idea that multiple dimensions or realms existed and could be crossed under the right conditions. The Sumerians were one of the first civilizations to write things down, and their myths are full of ideas that sound like alternate realms. They believed in three primary layers: the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, called Kur. These were seen as real planes of existence that affected your daily life. The gods lived in the heavens, humans lived on Earth, of course, and the dead went to Kur down below. And much like a multiverse concept, these realms could sometimes overlap. In stories like the Descent of Inan, the goddess Inanna travels to the underworld, dies, and then comes back. So they had this idea that entities could move between dimensions. The underworld was also not necessarily evil here, it was just another realm, operating under different rules. In fact, a lot of rituals were focused on keeping the borders between these realms stable, so that chaos wouldn't spill over, but controlled contact was still seen as possible. That's why they built ziggurats as stairways to the gods, not to merge the realms completely, but to create this stable link between heaven and earth. In ancient Indian texts, especially from the Vedic and later Hindu traditions, there's a really detailed breakdown of the universe. Not just one world, but many. They believed in multiple lokas or realms, each with its own purpose and beings. There's Svarga, which is kind of like heaven, Baloka, the earthly realm where we live, and Patala, the underworld. But that's just scratching the surface here, because some texts list 14 worlds, 7 higher and 7 lower, where gods, demons, spirits, and humans all live their lives in different layers of reality. These weren't vague ideas about the afterlife, they were very specific. Each realm was thought to have its own laws, its own beings, and even time was believed to work differently in each one. This weirdly lines up pretty well with modern ideas about how time could flow in alternate dimensions. So while they weren't using the type of language we use with parallel universes today, the Vedic did believe that there were many different realities stacked above and below our own. Same with the ancient Maya. They believed there were multiple levels stacked on top of and beneath the physical world. 13 layers of heaven and 9 layers of the underworld, all connected by something called the world tree. The human world sat in the middle between these layers, and everything was connected. The heavens weren't just above the clouds, and the underworld wasn't just underground. These were entire realms, each ruled by different gods and filled with spirits. What makes the Maya unique is how they tied all of this into their daily lives. Their temples and pyramids were built to mirror how they thought the universe was laid out. A step pyramid like the one at Chichen Itza was basically a map of the cosmos, showing the layers of heaven, earth, and the underworld stacked on top of each other. Even the ball game they played was connected to this. In some stories, the game represented a battle between life and death, or this struggle between this world and the next. Rituals, sacrifices, and ceremonies were also meant to keep these realms in balance. And now, ancient Greek mythology. A lot of us read about these stories in school, about all the gods, heroes, and creatures that would travel between different realms. Of course, you have the underworld, ruled by Hades, where the dead went, considered to be a separate realm that could also be entered by the living at times. Heroes like Heracles or Hercules journeyed there and came back. They also had the Olympian realm, placed high up on Mount Olympus, where the gods resided. And they also believed in the world of dreams, and other places like the fields of Elysium, where the righteous souls went after death. These were all considered real places, not just metaphors. For Greeks, they were woven into the fabric of life. It's really incredible. All these different cultures from opposite sides of the globe had very similar ideas about the nature of reality, or realities, should I say.
You get home and the door's unlocked. Someone's in the shower. It's you. A man named James from Missouri told his story to a paranormal podcast. He came home after a weekend trip and heard the water running. He assumed his roommate was home early, but when he opened the bathroom door, he froze. Why would he open the door when he thinks his roommate is in the shower? It's a creepy roommate. Anyways, the person in the shower had his tattoo, his build, his voice. They both screamed. The other James bolted through the back door and then vanished. When he told his roommate later, the roommate casually said, "Dude, I thought you were already here. I talked to you like an hour ago." What if one day everyone acted like you weren't you? In 2016, a woman named Marissa shared an incident in a thread about identity glitches. She walked into work and nobody recognized her. Her boss claimed they'd already spoken that morning. Her coffee was already at her desk. Someone had clocked in with her badge 20 minutes earlier. She checked the security footage and saw a woman who looked exactly like her, wearing the same clothes, walking into the office and doing everything that she normally did. The footage froze as the real Marissa walked in. Her double was never seen leaving. When your reflection moves before you do, run. A man in the UK posted on a lucid dreaming subreddit that he was brushing his teeth one morning when he noticed something was off. His reflection wasn't synced. It blinked a little too early, tilted its head before he did, and then it smiled. And he hadn't smiled. He turned around and ran out of the bathroom, nearly slipping. When he went back later, everything looked normal, except for one thing. The toothpaste cap was off, but he remembered screwing it back on. I guess the reflection didn't. Someone showed up at the DMV pretending to be you. Honestly, that's not so bad. They can wait in line for me. That's totally fine. In 2019, a man named Eric from Pennsylvania went to renew his passport and was told, "We already issued it yesterday." Confused, he checked, and sure enough, someone with his name, birth date, and even address had already picked it up. He asked for the security footage and saw someone who looked exactly like him down to a scar on his cheek, but Eric had been at work, logged into his company computer at the time. He reported it, but authorities never found the imposter or the passport. That's like crazy to think that your parallel universe doppelganger could come here and steal your identity. Would it even be a crime? I mean, technically, they are you. Sorry, I'm just like really having a moment. Like, guys, let's think about that for a second. Would they be jailed if they caught them? Let's say, yeah, they caught them. Would they be jailed for trying to steal your identity, even though it technically is their identity too? I don't know. Let me know down below. What if you met your double and they acted like you were the intruder? One of the most disturbing stories comes from a woman in Australia who shared her experience on a podcast called Somewhere Else. While staying at an Airbnb, she swore she saw someone walking into the living room from the hallway. A woman with her exact face and clothes. They locked eyes. The other version of her whispered, "You're not supposed to be here," and then apparently just disappeared into thin air. She packed up and left that night. When she checked the Airbnb listing later, it had been removed. No record of the host, no record of her stay. Even her confirmation email was gone. Doppelganger stories aren't just eerie. They challenge everything we think we know about identity, time, and maybe even reality itself. Whether they're signs of a multiverse, glitches in our simulation, or something stranger entirely, one thing's for sure, these stories are more than just spooky coincidences. They're warnings. What What would you do if you saw yourself walking out the door while you were still sitting at your desk? A Reddit user named Trigger Happy Greg, which we'll talk about that later, worked night shifts at a small call center. One evening around 2 a.m., his coworker looked up and said, "Didn't you just leave?" Confused, Greg replied, "What are you talking about? I've been sitting here." The coworker swore she saw Greg walk past her office and out the front door. Same hoodie, same walk, same everything. They even checked the security camera, and sure enough, there was Greg walking out. But Greg had never left, and the security footage glitched right as he hit the parking lot. Erased, like someone never meant for him to be seen. Imagine someone who looks exactly like you, calling your dog by name and walking down your street like they live your life. A woman from Oregon shared a chilling story on a paranormal Facebook group. Her neighbor knocked on her door one evening, confused, and asked, "Why didn't you say hi earlier? I saw you walking Max." Only this woman had been inside all day. Max, her golden retriever, hadn't left the house. The neighbor was adamant, said she even waved and the woman waved back. Creeped out, she checked her doorbell cam and saw someone with her exact face walking Max past the house. But, conveniently, the footage froze just as the double turned to look at the camera. What if you called your own phone and someone answered? A man named Alex recounted this story about parallel universes. While looking for his missing phone, he used his partner's device to call it, and someone picked up. The voice on the other end said hello, but it was his voice. The same tone, same speech pattern. The voice said, "Don't come looking for me," and hung up. Later, Alex found his phone under the couch, completely dead. There was no missed calls, no records of an incoming call. It was as if whoever answered was using a different version of his phone. What if someone knocked at your door and you answered while you were still upstairs? This story comes from a Reddit user named Mirror Moments, who shared an experience from when she was a teenager. One afternoon, she was upstairs in her bedroom when her friend came over and rang the doorbell. Her mom wasn't home, so no one should have answered, but her friend said that someone did, and it was her. The other her opened the door, smiled, and said, "I'm busy, come back later," before shutting it quietly. The friend was so weirded out by the interaction that she texted her asking what was going on. That's when Mirror Moments ran downstairs in confusion, only to find the door still locked. Her friend was standing outside, pale and wide-eyed. She swore that it was her. The same hoodie, the same voice, the same smirk. It was her friend. She knows what her friend looks like. When they checked the security cam footage later, it glitched right at the time the door supposedly opened. No motion, no video, just static, almost like something or someone didn't want to be seen. Someone showed up at your house claiming to be you, and your family believed them. Redditor Pale Orange Sky posted that her younger sister swore she'd picked her up from school one day, drove her home, and even helped with her homework. The problem? Well, she was working a double shift that day. Her car was parked at her job, and she had proof. Time cards, and surveillance. But her sister described the car perfectly, described her outfit, described conversations they'd supposedly had. Quote, "You told me to stay away from the old tree in the backyard," her sister said. Only she'd never said that before. Or at least, not in this universe. What's up with that old tree? I want to know why the parallel universe version was so concerned about the tree. Something mysterious.
In 1957, something terrible happened in the quiet town of Hexham, England. Two sisters, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock, were hit by a car and killed while walking to church. Their parents, understandably, were devastated, but about a year later, the mother got pregnant again, and in 1958, she gave birth to twins again. Jillian and Jennifer, they named them. Now, from the start, there were some odd things. Jennifer had birthmarks in the exact same place as Jacqueline had them, and as they got older, the twins started asking for toys that had belonged to their dead sisters, toys they'd never seen before. They even knew their names. They also seemed to have memories of places they'd never been, like a school the older girls had attended. One time the twins pointed out a park they claimed to recognize, saying, "That's where we used to play." By the time they turned 5, though, the memories began to fade. The girls grew up like normal kids, eventually forgetting all the strange things they used to say, but their father became convinced that Joanna and Jacqueline had been reincarnated into their twin sisters. Was it a case of parental grief mixing with coincidence, or did something actually transfer over? Like two souls refusing to move on, jumping right back into the same family. A lot of people who've heard this story kinda think so. And that's why the story of the Pollack twins became one of the most famous reincarnation cases ever recorded. In 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was driving home late at night in Minnesota when his car went into a ditch near the town of Lind. He wasn't hurt, he was just stuck, so he called his parents around 1:30 a.m. and asked them to come get him. He said he was near Lind. When they drove out there, they couldn't find him. He stayed on the phone with them for nearly 47 minutes, calmly describing where he was walking. Then suddenly, in the middle of the call, Brandon said, "Oh, and the line went dead. That was the last time anyone heard from him. His car was eventually found, but they never found a body, and to this day, Brandon Swanson's disappearance remains completely unsolved. In 1901, two English school teachers, Anne Moberly and Charlotte Jourdain, took a trip to Paris. While visiting the Palace of Versailles, they decided to explore the gardens near the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette's old stomping grounds. But as they wandered, something felt kinda off. The air got heavy, the atmosphere changed. The people they passed were suddenly wearing 18th century clothing. One man in a wide-brim hat looked downright ghostly even. They claimed the place felt lifeless and surreal, like walking into a painting. But then, out of nowhere, everything snapped back to normal. Later, they became convinced that they had time-slipped straight into pre-revolution France, possibly 1792. They even claimed to have seen Marie Antoinette herself sketching by the grass. They wrote a book about it under fake names, and the story became relatively famous. Some believed it, some said they were just delusional or making it up entirely, but both women stuck to their story for the rest of their lives. Were they hallucinating, or did they somehow catch a rip in time and stumble into the past? There's a patch over the South Atlantic Ocean called the South Atlantic Anomaly, and it's kinda like the Bermuda Triangle but for space. So satellites that pass over it glitch out. Laptops on the International Space Station will sometimes crash. Astronauts report seeing flashes of light even when their eyes are closed. Why? Because in this spot, Earth's magnetic field is weirdly weak, like dangerously weak, which allows more cosmic radiation to pour in. NASA even has to shut off instruments when passing over it because they can't guarantee accurate readings. Some satellites have flat out died after taking too many passes, and here's the freakiest part: the anomaly seems to be growing and splitting. And conspiracy theorists, they got plenty of theories. Ancient alien tech buried under the ocean, a secret underground base, a rift to another dimension, possibly.